Once upon a time, 3 little engines lived in their own little shed on their own little railway. Duke was brown, Falcon blue, and Stuart green. Duke was the oldest.
That's the start to Duke, the Lost Engine, the book that ties up so many hanging threads in the railway series by introducing a brand new railway from long, long ago. We explore the history of the Duke's old line, the Mid-Sodor Railway, and using new information discover the answers to some of the many Mid-Sodor mysteries. Our story starts here, at the Talaclin Railway in Towyn, where railway preservation was born. The railway is home to the Narrow Gauge Railway Museum, a wonderful collection of historical narrow gauge artefacts from all around the UK and Ireland. You may have seen me in a video on their YouTube channel, focusing on the Reverend Awdry's own model railway of Farquhar. The museum has a wonderful tribute to the life and works of the Reverend Wilbert Awdry, a recreation of his study made using the original furniture and his belongings, which were left to the Talaclin Railway when he sadly passed away. The Awdry study contains a wealth of information and resources for anyone interested in the railway series or Sodor topics in general. Which brings us to the topic of this video, the Mid-Sodor Railway. First, a basic history lesson. And for this, I will be talking strictly within the railway series canon, which differs slightly to the TV series in areas. Smudger does not exist. The railway opened in October of 1880 with a line of 25 miles stretching from Aylesbury Harbour up through the mountains to the fortified town of Peel Godred. The Earl of Sodor, Sir John Arnold Norramby, who was lovingly known as Our Duke by Sodrians, was a key figure in the formation of the railway and became its chairman. The first locomotive on the line, the Duke, was named in his honour. The railway paid its way until 1923. A very young North Western Railway Company, or as you may know it, the Fat Controllers Railway, struck a deal with the Peel Godred Power Company and had built a branch line from Kildane to Peel Godred for the transport of materials to aid construction of a new hydroelectric power plant and dam. This would begin the decline of the Mid-Sodor. By 1936, passenger and goods traffic was so low between Arlesdale and Peel Godred that the section was closed. All tourist services ceased and 3 of the 6 locomotives were sold off to keep finances up. When World War II began, the mines were stripped bare to assist with the war effort, eventually closing one by one in 1945. Only the single mine at Casnaharwen survived, and this eventually closed in December 1946 as a certain pumping engine failed, flooding the mine. The railway was closed for good in January 1947. Falcon and Stewart was sold to the Sodor Aluminium Company in Peel Godred to assist with a construction project, and later to the Skarloey Railway in 1951. Duke found no new owner. He was oiled, greased and sheeted up inside Arlesdale sheds. In 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Sir Robert Charles Norramby was killed in action while serving with the Sodor Regiment in North Africa. His 7-year-old son, Richard Robert Norramby, became the new Earl, but no one had told him about his own little engine, and Duke went forgotten. As previously mentioned, the only Mid-Sodor locomotives we really know about are Duke, Falcon and Stewart, numbers 1, 3 and 4 respectively. There is also Stanley, number 2. the engine that rode rough and was turned into a pumping generator behind the sheds. He was later moved to the Kasnehowen mine. So, what about those 3 engines that were sold in 1936? Who were they? For these answers, we must turn to another source of information, to something a bit more physical. The Reverend Awdry was a keen railway modeller and as such built a few layouts, one of which being Ulfstead Road, which depicted the Mid-Sodor Railway. The history of this layout can help us fill in the gaps that Wilbert left in his published materials on the Mid-Sodor's history and locomotives. One important thing to note when looking at the history of the layout is that it was built in 1968, 2 years before Duke the Lost Engine was published. This was the first book to show the Mid-Sodor Railway, though it had been alluded to a few times before it actually appeared.
You're an express engine, I believe. So am I, but I'm used to bogie coaches, not these cattle trucks.
Cora is a guard's van. She was my guard's van in the old days. Sir Handel likes Gertrude and Millicent best, Peter Sam went on. They remind him of when he used to pull our express. Men came and did that on our old line. And then, said Sir Handel, soon afterwards, it was
Sold, finished Peter Sam mournfully. There are no dukes. They were fine and stately, but they've all been scrapped. Rubbish, said Duncan. Of course he was real. All the same, Peter Sam persisted, he wasn't our Duke. Our Duke, said Sir Handel, is an engine.
This shows us that the Reverend had at least loosely planned an old railway that Sir Handel and Peter Sam were bought from, and that Duke was a planned character by 1965's Very Old Engines. In 1967, Small Railway Engines was published and hints towards this old railway in the Arle Valley, with the introductory paragraph reading, "Some lead mines up in the hills have long been closed." And later, in Duke the Lost Engine, we are told that the Arlesdale Railway was built on top of the old route of the Mid-Sodor. The old railway that Sir Handel and Peter Sam came from, first alluded to in 4 Little Engines, is not the Mid-Sodor Railway. At least yet. The concept evolved and changed over the years, from what I'd like to call, definitely not just the Cornish Railway, into the fully rounded Mid-Sodor Railway we know today. The Mid-Sodor Railway layout existed in 3 stages: the Mark I, the Mark II and the Mark III. These are all the exact same layout, just at different points in time. To give context on how the layout's evolution influenced the writing of Duke the Lost Engine, I think it's worth taking a look at these stages. The Mark I layout was built over the course of a few years, being finished in September 1968 for an exhibition in Worcester. It had to be 3'6" by 2'9" to fit in the boot of the Reverend's car. The layout was designed as a rabbit warren, which allowed the narrow gauge trains to dart in and out of the countryside. It also allowed a large section of the railway's sites to be on display, while still compacted into the small space. In reality, the stations would be much further apart. The first exhibition went well, and the layout was operated playing trains fashion, with no set timetable or planned movements. In August 1969, the layout had entered the Mark II stage, with the addition of a new station building for Ulfstead Road, based on the Cornish Railway's Easker Geliog station and built by Doris Stokes. There were other changes too. All of the people on the platforms were now in correct period clothing, and a proper timetable and operating sequence was written up, as a 3-day exhibition at Bristol in 1969 proved boring to the extreme without one. In October 1970, Duke the Lost Engine was published and featured the first representation of the Mid-Sodor Railway outside of the layout. One of the big differences between the layout and book was the absence of Stewart and Falcon. In 1974, the layout was requested to appear at a model railway show for the first time since 1969, so the Reverend decided to rework it to more closely resemble the railway shown in the book, with Stewart and Falcon models promptly being built, along with modifications to the other locomotives. The Mid-Sodor layout was last on display in 2004 at the Cadeby Light Railway, the brainchild of the Reverend Awdry's good friend, the Reverend Teddy Boston, or as some of you may know him better, the Fat Clergyman. The layout was photographed by Martin Clutterbuck for the Real Lives of Thomas the Tank Engine website in 2004, and this has been the main source of information on the subject. Sadly, the pictures are quite dated and compressed, but have been an invaluable resource. From this website, we have learnt of the other Mid-Sodor engines, such as Jim, Tim, and Albert, along with a photograph of the stock box, including other engines. Fans have only had this small bit of information to work from. As such, there is no way to know exactly what their names are or what kind of engines they are. Thankfully, I have a lot of new information to share. The layout, along with all of the locomotives, rolling stock and documents, are currently in the care of the Awdry family. I have been in contact with the custodian of the layout, who has been so very kind as to answer a lot of my questions and ramblings. They have sent me the pictures you are seeing of the layout at the moment, along with a lot of new information. So, with all this, let's see what the layout teaches us about the engines of the Mid-Sodor Railway. As we all know, number 1 is Duke. The Reverend made this model using an old Festiniog Railway Prince kit running on a Mini Trains 040 chassis. Later, a spur was made from the same type of kit running on an Arnold chassis. This seemingly became the more reliable of the two models, with the original becoming a spur. Number 2 is Stanley, a Baldwin 1012D bought in 1920 just after the end of World War I from Ministry of Defence surplus. Here I can exclusively reveal pictures of the Reverend Stanley model. The model was built using an original Gem Baldwin 590 kit, heavily cut down and running on an 060 Minitrix chassis. The livery it wore was plain black, with name and number displayed in yellow. He was used on workmen's trains and for a period of time had tram plates on the right side only, most likely to hide the lack of any valve gear. The model gave endless trouble. It wasn't very powerful and constantly derailed. Because of this, the model was retired and broken up, the leftover parts being turned into a pumping engine, which is still present on the layout now. While the Baldwins had a reputation for rough riding in real life, it's actually the poor behaviour of the Reverend's own model that inspired the story of Stanley in Duke the Lost Engine. Number 3 is Falcon. Built in 1904 for the Mid-Sodor Railway, here's a Hughes Falcon locomotive. The Reverend's model is quite the kit bash. Built in 1974 for the Mark III layout and running on a Mini Trains 040 chassis, the running board was scratch built out of plastic sheet, the smoke box from a cardboard tube, and heavily modified parts from an old Airfix pug kit were used for the cab and saddle tank. The chimney and smoke box door are white metal parts from a Gem Vari kit. The Reverend himself admits that the saddle tank is too long, and on a sideways view the engine fails to convince, but front and rear views are however good, track performance good, and reliable too. Number 4 is Stewart. Built in 1920 for the Mid-Sodor Railway, he is a Kerr Stewart Tattoo class locomotive. Stewart's model, built for the Mark III layout, is also quite a kit of various parts. Running on an Arnold 060 chassis with the coupling rod shortened, making it an 042 chassis. The model uses a Pico James kit as the base with a shortened cab. A Gem Prince smokebox and chimney was used to finish off the front end. Inexplicably, this model has buffers for some reason, which was not a feature of the Mid-Sodor Railway engines at all. Much like the Falcon model, Wilbert was aware of the less than satisfactory likeness to the real locomotive. The likeness to Edward Thomas was reasonable, but from a side view, the wheel spacing and size of rear wheels was glaringly noticeable. Both Stuart and Falcon were used on boat trains, the express service of the Mid-Sodor that connected with the Isle of Man steam ferry, taking passengers from the boat into the heart of Sodor and back again. Jumping forward, in 1986, the Reverend commissioned renowned 009 modeller Paul Windle to build a new model of Stuart, along with a Peter Sam. They were both scratch-built from plasticard, with metal saddle tanks, running on modified Minitrix chassis. I had the honour of restoring these earlier this year, as some parts had broken off in the box. There is also a second model of Falcon from around the same time. However, this was not built by Paul Windle. Sadly, there is absolutely no information on who built this for the Reverend. All three of these models are at the Narrow Gauge Railway Museum in Towyn. Next up, we have a locomotive that the Real Lives of Thomas the Tank Engine website names as Albert. And they're technically not wrong, but we'll be coming back to Albert later on. Number 6 is Jim. Unlike the engines we have talked about so far, Jim has no real class of engine he is based upon. The model was built in 1974 from a Gem Vari-Kit Type A, a completely freelance design, with the kit including different types of chimneys and fittings to allow the builder to customise the appearance to fit their needs. On the layout, Jim pulled a goods train named the Horse and Cart, which was given 2.5 hours to travel the line, stopping where it was needed to pick up and drop off goods, like a, well, horse and cart. Number 7 is Tim. He was also constructed in 1974 from a Gem Vari-Kit, this time the Type B, which has a different cab and running board. The model also showcases the different type of coal bunkers and tram skirts that could be fitted. On the layout, Tim pulled the workman trains for the miners, consisting of 2 or 3 coaches, known as bug boxes. And last but not least is the mine engine. There are in fact 2 mine engine models. The one you can see here, which was originally painted green, is the one currently stored with the layout. The other, however, is at the Narrow Gauge Railway Museum in Towyn. On this model, a number 9 is displayed on the side of the cab, along with a much longer chimney. This is the older of the 2 models, shown here on the Mark II layout. Both of these were made from the Playcraft Decorville 009 locomotives. Now, the popular consensus among fans is that the 2 mine engines are named Atlas and Alfred.
The Fat Controller laughed. Ho ho, you shouldn't listen to rumours, Thomas.
Firstly, there is only 1 mine engine, but it has 2 models, the other being a backup in case the first breaks down at a model railway show. The mine engine is nameless, yet the names Atlas and Alfred are not unfounded. Here, for the first time, is a picture of the real Atlas and Alfred. These 2 engines only appeared on the Mark I and Mark II layouts and weren't a part of the layout operating sequence. They were purely spares, in case any of the other engines stopped working, much like the backup mine engine. Alfred, numbered 4, is a bog-standard mini-trains Baldwin, while Atlas, numbered 8, was constructed out of spares that the Reverend had. A mini-trains Baldwin body, a spare cab, and an 060 chassis made by a company called Atlas, hence the name. Now that we've solved the mystery of Atlas and Alfred, let's rewind a bit to something I mentioned earlier. The stock box, full of those mysterious engines. Looking from the top down, we can see a few engines. We can clearly make out Tim and Stuart, who we already know about. But who's this in the bottom corner? This is Jerry, with a G, not a J. Built from a Pico Jeanette kit. That's Jeanette with a J, not a G. Again, an engine with no real prototype, though the kit does bear a resemblance to Doll and Andrew Barclay. Jerry was made for the layout when it was built in 1968 and ran on it in a green livery and numbered 5 until 1974 with the Mark III revisions to the layout. This is when Jerry was retired as a character model. He lost his name and number and was turned into a spur engine to replace Alfred and Atlas, who were completely removed from the layout. Next in the box, we have this red engine at the top. From above, you might be forgiven for thinking this is Rheneas. However, this is Jennings. Built with a running board and cab from the Pico James kit, an old tank wagon for the boiler, and a pen for the chimney, Jennings was meant to represent a locomotive built by Fletcher Jennings, like Dolgoch and Rheneas. Jennings was painted blue and wore the number 7 on their cab. The name was never displayed on the model, but it is referred to as such in notes by the Reverend. The model was built to run on the Mark II layout, as there was a need for another boat train engine in the new timetable. Sadly, Jennings would only run on the Mark II layout, ending up with the same fate as Jerry in 1974, being repainted into red and turned into a spur engine. And finally for this section, an even lesser known engine, not shown in the stock box picture. This is John, numbered 6 and painted the same blue as Jennings. John was made from a Pico James kit, again a freelance design based on no real locomotive, though it does loosely resemble engines built by Bagnall. John ran on the Mark I and Mark II layout. The model sadly no longer exists, as the Reverend dismantled it so he could reuse the chassis underneath the model of Stuart. Now, moving on, let's go back to Albert. Here we have Albert. Here we also have Albert. This is also Albert. Believe it or not, all 3 pictures I've just shown you are of the same model. Albert has had quite a long and eventful history. Originally, Albert Mark I was painted red and numbered 3, but was a bog standard mini trains 040 Baldwin, much like Alfred. As mentioned previously, in 1974, the Reverend wanted to update the layouts to more closely match the Mid-Sodor shown in the book. Accordingly, Albert had to lose the American look. The model was completely rebuilt, the saddle tank sanded down smooth and reshaped. A new cab was scratch built, and a new smoke box, made from a spur Kitmaster Pug firebox piece, was added. Now rebuilt, Albert Mark II was painted in a deep maroon and numbered 5, and looked a much nicer fit for the layout setting and time period than an American locomotive. In the layout history notes, the Reverend mentions that he made a spur twin of Albert Mark II, which I believe to be the locomotive pictured here, thanks to the similar cab shape and maroon livery. Now this bit is purely a theory, but I think this twin Albert may have once been Alfred, as it is definitely made from a mini train's Baldwin. Sometime between 1974 and 1984, Albert would be rebuilt once more. The cab and saddle tank remained, but a new running board, smoke box, chimney and tram skirts were added, all sourced from a Gem Vari kit Type B. The model was also now running on an 060 Minitrix chassis and repainted a light blue, losing his name and number in the process. So, there's a reason why I skipped over the last engine in the stock box. Meet Albert Mark III. Yes, another Albert. Thankfully, things are a lot simpler than they seem. As I just mentioned, when Albert Mark II was rebuilt and painted blue, he lost his name and number. Albert Mark III is the reason behind this. The Mark II was turned into another purely spare engine like Jerry and Jennings. The name Albert and number 5 were given to this new model, which was another Gem Vari Kit B, like Tim, except with different fittings. I'm afraid I don't have any solid date on when Albert Mark II was retired and the Mark III took over. But I do know that it must have happened before 1984, as this Albert appears in a very short segment focusing on the Reverend in the ITV Anglia programme Bygones, which aired on the 4th of September 1984.
Sodor is the island the Reverend Awdry invented, where all the stories have happened and all his characters still live. He built a model of Thomas's branch line, which he takes to lectures. It runs to a schedule as precise as any real railway. It's an exercise for the imagination.
It's hard to imagine how the Reverend's box might have turned out without his modelling, and nowhere is this clearer than with the Mid-Sodor Railway. Between the published information and the final form of the layout, we can fill some of the gaps that have long been incomplete. I believe that the Mid-Sodor's locomotive roster, at least in his mind, is as follows. Number 1. Duke. Number 2, Stanley. Number 3, Falcon. Number 4, Stuart. Number 5, Albert. Number 6, Jim. And number 7, Tim, along with the mine engine, who was privately owned by the mining company. My reasoning behind this roster comes in the form of notes from one of Wilbert's many lectures on the history of Sodor's railways. This isn't to say that John, Jennings, Jerry, and maybe even Albert Mark II cannot be canon, as after all, engines came and went. But sadly, we have no real way to know if they were. I really hope you have all enjoyed this video. It has been such a joy to research, and I am ever so grateful to the current custodian of the Mid-Sodor layout and the rest of the Awdry family, the Tallaghline Railway Preservation Society and the Narrow Gauge Railway Museum for assisting me in this endeavour. I'd like to think that Wilbert will be happy that his stories and models are still providing excitement and curiosity over 75 years on.